best way to start a discovery call is with what's called a pre-frame. A pre-frame is an influence technique used to limit the scope of a conversation so that you can drive it towards a very specific outcome. And I pre-frame all of my calls is by saying the way these calls usually go is, and then I outline the quickest process to get through qualification, discovery, and then to close the deal. Now, the best way to think about pre-framing a call is by acting like a doctor. Acting like a doctor is the best metaphor for the mindset behind a successful diagnosis or discovery call. Think of it like this: when you go and visit a doctor, they ask you a series of questions and you answer them. Then, before the doctor tells you the solution to your painful problem that you've come to them, you're essentially an inbound lead to them at this point, they ask a few more questions. Then they might send you for a scan. Then they sit there in their posh white coat, emotionless, start making notes, and then they quiz you on a few related points. And if they're a good doctor, they're asking you about things that you haven't even considered might be tied to the acute pain that you're in. It's only after the entirety of this process that the doctor makes a formal diagnosis and offers a solution. They only offer a solution when they've got a full picture of all of the issues, the complications, and then the second and third order consequences of those issues as well. Now, hopefully you can see how this is very literally the opposite of how most sales calls go. On an average sales call, if the buyer mentions any pain whatsoever, even if the slightest of niggles, the seller gets the picture and starts shoving it down the buyer's throat and tries to close the deal. So when we're pre-framing, whether this is a diagnosis call, whether this is a call later on in the sales process, regardless, when we are pre-framing, what we want to do is set the conversation up, then talk less and ask more. More diagnosis and you will close more deals. So if you want more success during your discovery calls, you need to think more like a doctor. Now, let's tie this in with the pre-framing that we covered at the top of the video. So when you go to visit a doctor, you know that you have a problem. And you also trust in the fact that the doctor has seen this problem many, many, many times before. You're not there to argue with them. You're there to get a solution, right? So our pre-framing at the top of a discovery call in this context might sound like this. The way these calls usually go is I'll ask you a few questions. We'll see where your sales team's performance is against the data that I have on your industry. And if I think I can help, I'll share a few ways of how we might be able to work together. Sound good? And did you notice the sound good at the end of this statement? This is what's called a micro close. And you can learn more about micro closes if you would like to do so by grabbing a free copy of my book, Selling Made Simple, which you can find over at salesman.com. But what we're doing here is getting a small commitment from the prospect where they agree to our process of conducting this call. And when they verbally agree, they are way, way more likely to act and behave like a patient rather than doing what most prospects do when you start to shove a pitch down their throat, where they start to ask about price, discounts, and they put up their guard and their shield, and they won't give you the information that you need to successfully diagnose the problems. Okay, so that's how to pre-frame. Straight after the pre-frame, though, there's a part of the diagnosis call process or the discovery process that people get wrong all of the time. And that is that they try and tell the prospect what the prospect wants, what their pain is, what their issue is that they're going in to see the doctor in the first place to see, rather than truly discussing the patient's issues. Now, telling the buyer that they're in pain is obviously not as motivating as allowing the buyer to tell you that they're in pain instead. Why is this? Well, obviously, people don't like to be told how they feel. They will literally rebel against it, even if you're highlighting the truth. So how do we get the buyer to tell us what the current state is, the pain that they're in, and also the brighter, bolder future reality that they'd like to move towards? Well, we ask questions. This is not rocket science, but the structure of how we can make this more effective is pretty interesting. Think of each of the questions that come up in your diagnosis call, your discovery call, as being done in a 3-step process. First, we want to ask the question and see if the buyer actually knows the answer. So we're asking questions of what are the consequences of this? Is there budget in place to solve this problem? The usual diagnosis call and discovery questions we've covered on this channel many times. Now, asking these questions can often create awareness in problems that the buyer did not know that they had. And that's where we truly start to do some consulting and adding value to the buyer during the call itself. Now, step 2, the nudge. If the buyer isn't seeing the impact of the issues as we ask these questions, we try and share a different perspective with them. And if they don't understand that perspective, we try again. And we try again, and we keep nudging them until they do understand the consequences or the issues or the pain that we've uncovered. And if this seems a bit theoretical, I'm going to give you an example in a second, so stay tuned. Step 3 of this process is then to recap. So once you've gathered a couple of points, we're going to recap the information and we're going to confirm that the buyer agrees with what we shared with them. So for example, during your diagnosis call or your discovery call, we might ask the question, what led you to getting this call booked in with us today? And if we sell sales training and the buyer starts talking about marketing, then we might nudge them. So I might go, okay, great. Marketing is an issue here. What about your sales process? How is that working out for you right now? So do you see how we've acknowledged what the buyer has said, but then we've nudged them back on the right tracks for this call to be a success? We've set the criteria of the call during the pre-frame. Now it's our job to keep the conversation on track. And they might not get it. They might say, our sales process is fine. In which case, I'll try and nudge them again. Okay, great. What do the numbers look like year on year? And we do this over and over and over again until we're both on the same page and we know the problem that's being diagnosed and we've positioned ourselves as the solution provider to solve that problem. Then we move on to step 3 and we recap it to get acknowledgement from the buyer that they understand what the issue is and how to solve it. So my recap in this example might be, okay, interesting. So you booked the call because of your marketing, but we touched on the sales side of things and your process isn't up to scratch. Is that fair? The buyer says yes, and then we can move forward with our next question. Now, this 3-step process allows you to understand what the buyer thinks is the current reality, the pain that they're in, but also nudge them to understand any other angles about this current reality that they might not have considered yet. Heck, this could disqualify buyers as well. I have people come to me saying, I've got a sales problem, when what they've got isn't a sales problem, it's that their business is terrible. They have got no value proposition, no product market fit. There's a whole mess of problems that would need resolving before we can really focus on top line sales itself. So this is both a process of qualification, but also disqualification as well. So we're going to ask, we're going to nudge, we're going to recap, and this must start from the moment that your prospect picks up the phone on a discovery call. Otherwise, this dynamic of the doctor and the patient is going to fall apart. So there we go. That is how to pre-frame a discovery call, benefit from the doctor mindset, and how to ask, nudge, and recap to keep your calls on a pathway towards a close. And if you enjoyed this video, why not click the video that's on the screen right now and continue making selling simple.